The ultimate end of gerrymandering is to continue to be able to exercise power, even though you do not have democratic legitimacy to do so.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Wilson, and you're listening to What the Gerrymander, brought to you by Hoosier Victory Alliance, an organization I co-founded. This podcast is our attempt to raise the alarm about the war MAGA Republicans are waging against Americans in Indiana and across the country. MAGA is implementing a strategy of voter suppression, gerrymandering, and cruel legislation to take away our freedom and increase their power. MAGA is using fascist tactics, corruption, conspiracy theories, and disinformation to make themselves and their billionaire funders richer and more powerful. They target the most vulnerable among us, but make no mistake, we and our children are targets too, whatever our gender, color, sexual orientation, or location. Across the country, the fascist MAGA party is forcing transgender kids and adults to detransition, greatly increasing the risk of suicide. MAGA is pushing gun ownerships for white Christians as part of their war and pretending to believe that more guns makes America safer. We know this is a vile lie, and our children are paying the price with their lives. And MAGA has systematically stripped bodily autonomy for women, first in red states and potentially nationwide. MAGA is banning books, and if they can't ban books, they're shuttering public libraries, defunding public education, and outlawing the teaching of the real history of America. All this is connected, and it's a war against you and me and all Americans who want to live in a pluralistic democracy. Today's guest is Sheila Seuss Kennedy, Emerita Professor of Law and Public Policy at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. Until her retirement, she was a faculty fellow with both the Center for Religion and American Culture and the Tobias Center for Leadership Excellence, an adjunct professor of political science and founder of the Center for Civic Literacy at IUPUI. In 1980, she was the Republican candidate for Indiana's then 11th congressional district seat. In 1992, she became the executive director of the Indiana affiliate of the ACLU. We had a great conversation about her journey from being a liberal Republican to leaving the Republican Party after it had moved irreversibly to the right. She currently works in Democratic circles for democracy and freedom and against gerrymandering and voter suppression. We also discussed the systemic barriers to democracy, the effects of gerrymandering, the hope that Gen Z will bring, and the challenge inherent in changing a system designed to be difficult to change. Hello, Sheila. I am so glad that you could make it today. And I've been reading your blog, and I know that you are a former Republican, and you're also a former executive director of the Indiana ACLU.
Yes, not two things that usually go together, but
exactly. So I wanted to know if you could tell us a little bit about your journey and what you're up to these days in the present day.
Sure. I was a pretty active Republican for 35 years. In fact, was the corporation counsel for the city of Indianapolis in a Republican administration, ran for Congress as a Republican and won a Republican primary, despite the fact that I was pro-gay rights and pro-choice, something that would not happen today. That was in 1980. I did not win that election, and subsequently did take over as executive director of the Indiana affiliate of the ACLU, which I found to be perfectly consistent with what Republicans were when I joined the party. And in fact, I wrote a book, one of my very first books, called What's a Nice Republican Girl Like Me Doing at the ACLU? Obviously, the Republican Party as it exists today is absolutely nothing like the Republican Party that cared about civil liberties and individual liberty when I joined. So it took me until the year 2000, and I formally left the Republican Party. And one of the things that I liked best about that departure was that the local chapter of Stonewall, which is a gay rights organization, had a coming out party for me. And I thought that was cool. And I have subsequently been a pretty active Democrat. I really believe that I am what we used to call conservative. I believe in conserving the liberties of the Bill of Rights, but it is just amazing when you live long enough, evidently, and I've lived a long time, I'm old, you see what they call the Overton window shift. And the Overton window, for those of your listeners who might not know, is a fancy term for what looks like the moderate position between extremes at any given time. And of course, we have moved so far to the right that I used, when I ran for Congress, and lost, people would come up to me afterward and say, Sheila, I like you. I would have voted for you, but you're so conservative. Today, I have very much the same political philosophy that I had then, and I am routinely accused of being a communist. That is how far the political spectrum has shifted. So that's that's sort of where I've been and where I am now.
That's quite, well, I wouldn't say that's quite a journey. I would say that the Republican Party has made the journey rather than you. As we were discussing before, this podcast is called What the Gerrymander because we talk about what the effects of MAGA Republican gerrymandering and voter suppression have brought. And one of our goals is to make clear what the aims of the MAGA Republicans are today, which is accruing power. So, and also as former guests, particularly Ryan Bussey, who used to be a gun company executive, he said to us, this is a war. The NRA has been fighting this war for decades, and they don't care about individual policy differences. And we are never going to win if we view this as individual policy fights. It's an overall worldview. And their goal is to roll back the 20th century.
Yeah. Well, the whole point of gerrymandering, especially now Republican gerrymandering, is to enable Republicans to have far more representation, not only in Congress, but in state legislatures than they would be otherwise entitled to, because they are very much now a minority party. When you take a look at Congress and see how close the last several elections have allowed the Democratic and Republican parties to be, the last time I looked, Democrats had won over 2 million more votes than Republicans. And that was when Republicans had a slight majority in the House. I mean, the ultimate end of gerrymandering is to continue to be able to exercise power, even though you do not have democratic legitimacy to do so.
Exactly. One of the founding principles of Who's Your Victory Alliance is the idea that David Pepper talks about, which is that states have become, unlike Louis Brandeis, when he said laboratories of democracy, they've become laboratories of autocracy. And that state representatives, state legislatures in very MAGA-dominated states have become unrepresented, like Indiana, like Ohio, like Tennessee, like all of the South have become unrepresentative, and the people are largely unknown. People don't know who their representatives are, and largely unaccountable. And so one of our goals is to figure out how to change that. And as a result of voter suppression, a lot of people have kind of checked out, I think. And so I wonder if you would talk about voter suppression, voter participation. What is it going to take to get more voter participation? And how do we reverse this?
one of the things that I think is least understood about gerrymandering is that it is the best voter suppression mechanism out there. Because if you have a district, if you live in a district that you believe is safe, and you are not, well, actually, if you're in either party, but certainly if you are in the party that is not the party for which your district is safe, uh, you really have no encouragement, no incentive to go to the polls. And of course, what has happened in certainly in Indiana is the party that considers that district unwinnable often doesn't even put up a candidate, which gives no one an incentive to go to the polls. There are two major outcomes of successful gerrymandering. One is voter suppression. Most people, I remember Jon Stewart years ago on The Daily Show said, most people have shit to do. I mean, you're not going to take advantage of going to the polls if you are convinced that it is an exercise in futility.
That's right.
So that suppression of the vote is widespread, and it is, I think, a less recognized outcome of gerrymandering. The other part is gerrymandering is really responsible to a great extent for the polarization that we now see in Congress and in the states. When you have safe districts, and I don't care if it's safe for Republican or Democrat, the incumbent is most worried about being primaried. So the Republicans looking over the right shoulder, the Democrats looking over the left shoulder. And what they want to do is ensure that they are extreme enough within their party structure to avoid that primary battle. So little by little, and rather than initially what was intended was for each party to find and field a candidate who is acceptable to the broad middle, you have people who are extreme on either side. And since in primaries, there's lots of data that shows that the people who come to vote at a primary are the more ideological of whichever party it is. So what you get is an extremist Republican or an extremist Democrat, and lose the ability to negotiate, to sit down with each other and actually pass laws. I mean, we've got what I call a performative political class right now. They're either going on Fox News to talk dirty to the MAGA folks, or the Democrats simply are not that extreme. What you've got right now, instead of the Republican Party that I used to belong to, which had room for folks like me, and you now have a cult that marches to the drummer or whatever Donald Trump is, and all I know is he's mentally ill, and I don't know what to call it. But then the Democrats are faced with a terrible problem because everybody who isn't insane these days is not a Republican. And so the Democrats have to herd cats, essentially. They have to represent everyone from the more liberal Republicans who've left that party all the way to what in the United States we consider far left, which is kind of moderate in Europe. So you've got a huge range of opinion that is represented by the Democratic Party, and a cult that operates as today's Republican Party. It is not. It does not bode well for the country.
I had Bryn Tannehill on as my guest a couple of weeks ago, and she's a vet. She wrote a book called American Fascism, and she's transgender. And she was very, very pessimistic about the future of our country. And I'm wondering whether you have any optimism, and if you do, where that comes from.
Okay, I do, and it comes from 21 years of teaching students at the local university. Because, as I have said many times, I would turn this country over to my students in a heartbeat. They came into my classes not necessarily knowing a lot. I mean, one of the things that I get really concerned about is the state of civic education in this country. But they were inclusive. They cared about their neighborhoods and their communities, and they were teachable. You know, they, especially my graduate students who tended to be a little bit older, than in their 30s, they were great. And I know that there's a certain amount of self-selection. And I also know that politically, we are one of the huge dividing lines in the United States today is between educated and uneducated people. There are complications and consequences to that worry me a great deal. But having said that, I think the younger people are finally beginning to realize that they have to get politically active. I see a lot of evidence that gives me some hope. That, the reason gerrymandering is so important, and it's not the only thing. We have mechanisms, systems in this country that are much more important than the individuals who are being elected. And I think that is something that is harder for voters to understand, that we have systemic problems that we need to fix. One of them, top of my list, is gerrymandering, but also the Electoral College. I mean, it is offensive that 3 million people, more people voted for Hillary Clinton than Donald Trump, and Donald Trump became president. That should not happen. So there's that. There's today's misuse of the filibuster. We have to take a look at these systemic problems. And if we get rid of those, I have a great deal of confidence in the general American public. Granted, over the last few years, I realize there are a lot more bigots and racists and anti-Semites and homophobes than I ever thought, but they're still far from a majority. Most Americans are nice people. I am absolutely convinced of that. And what we have to do is get rid of these artificial barriers to a democratic result.
So, given our systemic barriers to change, which were purposeful when they were created, but have outlived their, well, that's really, okay. Let's really be real here. That they were created so that the slave owning Southern politicians would join the Union and play ball.
Yeah.
And now are very clearly undemocratic. But given the actual restraints that this puts on the system itself, how do you change the system while you're still part of this system?
That is what we used to call the $100,000 question. In Indiana, we face incredible barriers to change because in order to change, for example, gerrymandering, we would have the people who would have to change it are the people who benefit from it. So the legislature is not ever going to do anything about it. I was one of the people who served on the legislative study committee that looked into redistricting a couple of years ago. And we had hundreds of Hoosiers who came to the state capitol for those hearings, all of whom wanted change. And I believe that the correct characterization of the legislature's response was something along the lines of up yours. I mean, forget it. The only thing in a state like Indiana, which does not have a referendum available, is massive turnout, because the one area that is weakest about the gerrymandering is what the people who draw those lines have to depend upon the prior year's turnout to figure out, how many Republicans and how many Democrats are going to be in a given district. And that prior year's turnout does not at all reflect the actual makeup of many of those districts. In some cases it does, the more rural districts. But I was friendly with a young woman who ran as a Democrat in one of those districts last time. And she went door to door, and she said what shocked her most was the number of people that she met who said, "Oh, I thought I was the only Democrat who lived here." It is a system that has told people, you're in such a minority, you might as well not even vote. So if we could actually convince a lot of those people to go to the polls, some of those safe districts would not be safe. But people have been really robbed of their franchise, if you will, by
Yeah.
the fact that they're told over and over that, well, you live in a safe district, why should you even bother? There's another aspect to that too, and that is that as one woman said at a meeting I was at a couple of weeks ago, particularly young and educated people have moved out into some of the collar counties around Indianapolis over the last couple of years, and many, if not most of them, are not Republican. So and they're new voters in those districts. I think in a state like Indiana that has a truly reprehensible legislature and no citizen referenda or remedy, the only thing we can do is try for, massive get out the vote, and explain to people, you may think your vote doesn't count, but it really will.
Right. One of the things that we've talked about is the fact that you alluded to, that a lot of the districts, the safe districts, Republicans run unopposed. So Every State Blue, which is this organization that created Blue Ohio, Blue Missouri, their purpose for being is to crowdfund money to run candidates in every district. And the paradigm shift is that for those people, their goal isn't to win.
Mm.
Their goal is to get every vote out that they possibly can. And so it might not matter in the short term in that district, but it could certainly lift up statewide candidates and get them more votes. So we're trying to put that together for Indiana.
That would be great. Call on me if you do. Now, I still remember a graduate class I had, several years ago, and I had an unfortunate habit before each election, whether it was a primary or general. I would look at the class and say, how many of you are registered to vote?
Right.
And how many of you are going to vote? And I would give extra credit if they would bring in those stupid little I voted stickers, and one of my better students raised his hand and he said, Professor, I always vote, but I live in Noblesville. And I went online to make sure that my polling place hadn't changed. And I thought, well, while I'm here, I'll look and see. And there were no contests. Why should I go? Well, perfectly reasonable question. And as long as we don't field candidates in every district, that again is part of the really brilliant vote suppression that occurs with gerrymandering.
Absolutely. Well, our only barrier to starting Blue Indiana is getting up the starting funds. So if you can entreat everyone you know to help us with that, that would be fantastic.
Well, I tell you what, my blog does get fairly wide distribution. If you send me an explanation of what Blue Indiana is trying to do, I would be delighted to put it on the blog and link to wherever it is people need to send their dollars.
Thank you. That would be very, very helpful. We would very much appreciate that. That's fantastic. I will do that.
Good.
So having said all of that, I want to take a little bit of a left turn here and ask you, because you, along with everybody I've talked to, has pretty much asserted with very good reason that this Gen Z is our biggest, greatest hope. Last month, you wrote in your blog, and I'm going to quote, "In 2016, I reluctantly concluded that the actions and votes of a significant minority of Americans could only be explained by racism. Mm-hmm. I have no reason to modify that conclusion since." Can you talk about the role of racism, white Christian nationalism, and how you view both of those in today's climate, the rise of it, but also the unveiling of what was already there?
I think my youngest son said something right after the 2016 presidential election that I think summarized everything. He said, there were two kinds of people who voted for Donald Trump, and only two kinds. One were those for whom his racism and bigotry resonated, and those for whom it was not disqualifying. And as I said, I mean, he's pretty smart. There is no way that any rational, and I grant you there are a lot of irrational people, but would look at some of the people who are now, I mean, forget Trump, because I would love to forget Trump. Marjorie Taylor Greene and her Jewish space lasers. I keep saying, listen, I'm Jewish. If I had a space laser, I'd be using it.
You know? Right. I say the same thing.
And I know just what I would do with it. We are looking at you're too young to remember the Keystone Cops, but that is what we see when we look at our Congress. No wonder nothing gets done. I mean, actual governance is kind of boring. It's kind of important too. At any rate, I think that, you know, if we look back through American history, the Father Coughlins, we forget that there were a lot of pro-Hitler Nazis in the United States before World War II. It's always been there. And what has also always been there, that when things are not comfortable in a society, when you have economic distress, when you have social distress, whatever, you look for someone to blame. You look for a scapegoat. The only reason that women have a chance to be civically equal is because we have control of our own reproduction. The pill did more to take women away from, we used to be property. And what has allowed us to move toward partnership is control of our reproduction. And what the MAGA movement is all about, and this gets back to your question about bigotry, we have a group of old white guys, old Christian white guys. We have people who are terrified of losing their social dominance. They look at the uppity women. They look at why there are Black people and gay people are holding hands on the street and getting married. I mean, what is the world coming to? I am losing my place in society. I'm losing status. And much more than economics, loss of status absolutely terrifies people. And so right now, with immense social change that is impossible to ignore, all of those ancient hatreds are emerging. And it is very scary. But again, I say my students were not bigots. They were not, they have gay friends, they have Jewish friends, Muslim friends. The problem is we have these social systems, these political systems that are making change incredibly difficult.
That's very true. But I would like to talk about systemic racism and anti-Black bias as separate but related to all of the other biases. And would love to know what you think of the role of anti-Black bias in Indiana, which has got a lower African American population than, say, the South, and in other MAGA captured states. Is that reasonable to pull that out from the entire surround? Because it's going to be important when to figure out how we come together into coalition.
Yeah. The internal problems, I think, of the feminist movement has been that for a very long time it was an upper class white woman feminist movement. And if you take a look, especially in the efforts to blue up states, African American women have been at the forefront. They have done so much. I don't know that anti-Black bigotry emerges from any different place in the human psyche than anti-Semitism and anti-gay feelings. In one sense, I sort of think haters will be haters, and they will find some reason to hate. But also, skin color is so obvious. There are other markers of difference that can or cannot be, some people can pass, but skin color has been for so long. And of course, then we've got the residual effects of 200 years of slavery and the social attitudes that emerged about that. So I think racism is almost a harder problem than other kinds of bigotry. Although, we are seeing one of the good things that has happened in the last few years has been the real evaporation of so much anti-gay hatred and when same-sex marriage came in, I don't remember the numbers now, but today something like 70% of Americans say, yeah, fine, and what I've been noticing, you mentioned transgender guest, the effort to really beat up on and attack transgender kids comes from a very cold calculation by some of the MAGA folks that they can no longer, with impunity, talk about those gay people. So they're focusing on one area of the population that is less understood by most people and seems stranger. So we'll coalesce around hating those folks. I mean, some of this is very strategic. It is, some of it at the very top comes not from necessarily hatred, but an understanding that you can use the hatred of less well-educated people and focus it in ways that help you meet your political goals.
Right. Those funders at the top, the Harlan Crows and the Koch brothers, and every, wealthy, powerful group since the beginning of time has realized that if you can get the people downstream to fight against each other, they're not noticing that the people at the top are really taking more than their fair share.
Well, we now know that the anti-abortion movement started something like 6 years after Roe v. Wade and was not at all the function of some moral uprising. It was because Jimmy Carter, his administration had refused to give some of these Christian academies, refused to allow them to use donations as a tax write-off. And the then Republicans were upset about that, wanted to get rid of him, and knew that you couldn't start a movement that was pro-segregation at that point. So what could they do to rouse the evangelical troops? And I mean, so suddenly the Southern Baptist congregations had, when Roe came out, said, good decision, because this should be left to people. It was entirely a strategic effort to get, and it worked for a very long time, to get those little evangelical people to the polls to vote against the baby killers.
Speaking of baby killers and the people who literally allow enough guns to kill a lot of.
Well, intellectual consistency is not a hallmark.
So intellectual consistency is not a hallmark. And yet, when you take some of their views and unravel it to their logical conclusion, which we know where that can go, it is an ideologically consistent view. If you start it really from the center, which is white, male, Christian hegemony.
Yeah.
And then taking everybody else out of the picture.
Yeah.
So
I'll see you back in the kitchen barefoot and pregnant. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank goodness I'm past that.
With an African-American maid.
Right. And no washing machine. Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on. I think that what you had to say is really important for people to hear. And I look forward to working with you if we can to help get people running for every seat we can manage in the Indiana legislature. Luckily, there's blue Ohio, blue Missouri, and blue Texas right now. Blue Tennessee is starting up, and we're trying to start at blue Indiana. So the idea is gaining traction, and hopefully it will make progress.
Well, my argument in the book is that if we're going to be saved, it'll be by the women.
And the children.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to What the Gerrymander. We're working toward building Blue Indiana and ask that you make a small recurring donation at HoosierVictoryAlliance.org. If you like what you heard today, please subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. We thank you, and democracy thanks you.